Okay.
Hey guys, welcome to Kathleen Hale. We saw her in chat yesterday, and here she is in person. Kathleen, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Thank you guys so much for having me on.
And you are in LA, right?
Yeah, I'm in Los Angeles right now. It's extremely hot outside. How is South Africa?
Extremely cold. Yeah,
Okay.
extremely cold, which is why our sort of power utilities sort of putting our arms behind our backs. Everyone's striking at the moment, and they trying to make sure they get a pay rise when everyone's desperate to have power. So that's why they're doing it at the coldest time of year.
Wow.
So if you can send some of your heat this way, it would work. It would be good.
I'll put it in the mail.
What part of LA are you in?
I'm in a neighborhood of LA called Echo Park. Um,
Okay.
it's just a couple minutes from downtown. Yeah.
Okay. Because funny enough, we're having another guest on tomorrow is also from LA.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Anyway, so I just want to apologize to my crowd for this weirdness that's going on. I actually bought a green screen. I don't know if this cord's got something to do with it, but no problems yesterday. Today, glitch mania. So I don't know. Okay, so Kathleen, do you want to tell us how this article came about
Yeah,
in Vanity
sure.
Fair? Yeah.
Totally. Thank you so much. It's so good to see you guys again. I'm a little bit nervous. You're all so cool, and it was really fun to be around you yesterday and see some of the things that you were saying about the Gabby Petito murder. I think I learned a lot, and you guys just seem like such experts, and it's really exciting to be around people who are as interested in this story as I am. So how it came about was that when I think September 11th, when Gabby Petito's missing person flyer went out, I was hooked immediately because, um, it was unfolding in real time. I mean, I think I was interested in it for the same reason that everyone was interested in it, and, there's been a lot of discussion about things like missing white woman syndrome and things of that nature with in terms of the Gabby Petito disappearance. And obviously, if Gabby had not been so beautiful and like looked a certain way, it probably would not have caught the global attention. But I was drawn to it because of Brian Laundrie was a terrible white man. So maybe like a terrible white man criminal syndrome sort of set in for me. I really wanted to see him held accountable. I really wanted to see him brought to justice. And I had just finished reporting a book called Slenderman that's coming out in a couple months. And that reporting process took me 5 years. Spent a ton of
Hmm.
time with the people who were involved in the case, a lot of time with Morgan Geyser, who stabbed her best friend 19 times and now lives in a locked psychiatric ward. So I was coming off of that and just feeling like very like I didn't want to report my next piece the same way had reported Slenderman because I was burnt out from the 5 years of research. I was burnt out from the how emotionally attached I'd gotten to the people who I came to write about. And Nick, you know this as a writer as well, but when you write about people, you have to, if you're interviewing them in person, gain their trust. You become connected to them, and in the end, it's a very sad process because nobody likes being written about, even if you are being 100% compassionate. And so there's like it's a roller coaster ride in terms of getting attached to people, hearing their stories, trying to tell their stories in an entertaining way. And I said to myself, this is I want to chase down this Gabby Petito story, and I want to report it entirely online because I thought thematically that had significance. So I did a forensic deep dive into their social media to get a sense of who they were. And a lot of Brian's social media, I think pretty much all of it has been taken down now. But I watched the story unfold day by day, and I think around when Gabby's body was found, on the 20th, or it was 19th or the 20th, um, I I realized that there was the avalanche of news had buried all of this stuff that I had watched come out like piece by piece. And so I was really glad that I had watched it from moment one, because I don't think I would have been able to get some of those initial
Yeah.
news pieces otherwise. And I started writing a book, and I wrote about 140 pages. Um, and then I thought, well, maybe I could sell this as an article, because that's what I did with Slenderman. I sold it as an article, and then I took the article out to publishers, and I was so lucky Vanity Fair really liked it. And so what
When
I
was
did,
that?
when was that? That was like, I think 2 months ago. Wait, maybe actually, no, more than that. I think it was about 3 or 4 months ago. And so what I did with the editor was we went through the entire manuscript I'd written, and we pulled the scenes where we felt like, okay, here, 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 and we put together, I mean, a short for me in terms of a book, but long for Vanity Fair, about 6,000 words.
Mm.
And we went from there.
Yeah, it is long. 6,000 words is about three times longer than your sort of typical long article. A lot of articles are really 1,000 words or so.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, yeah, so for Vanity Fair, isn't that even quite long?
It is, for the magazine, it feels
Mm.
especially long. I was so grateful that they let it go
Yeah,
over a
yeah.
bit, because I feel like it was as short as it possibly could be while
Yeah,
still
yeah, yeah.
telling the
Well, I know
story.
that feeling so well. I know that feeling
Yeah.
really, really well. But that's a really great compliment to you, them stretching out their word count boundary because it was justified. I think that's a really good compliment to you.
Thank you so much. And the way that I got turned on to you is that my husband was watching your show yesterday
Oh, okay.
live. And
Oh,
then
okay.
he saw that it was about my article, so he sent me the link, and then I started watching, and I was just I it was my introduction to your channel. I loved it. I love the way you talk about these stories. You really get into sort of like the mindset. It's, it's more about like what were these people thinking and feeling,
Mm.
and where were they coming from, and that's stuff that I'm super interested in. And then I saw your fans, and I was like, these people are incredible. I learned things, and so it was such an exciting coincidence.
Is it your husband? His name's not Len, is it?
No, that's my
Because I
second
got
husband. No, I'm just kidding.
no, because I got a strange, like moments before I went live, I got a strange Instagram message from, I know your surname is Hale, and this person's surname was Hale, it's with an S, and I was like, is this a weird coincidence? Is this, and I thought maybe it's something, maybe it's nothing, and then I assume it is nothing, but that is quite strange. Yeah.
It's really weird.
Okay, so the piece that you wrote, the original piece that you wrote that had to be trimmed down, how long was that?
Uh, the thing that I had to comb from to make the Vanity Fair article, I sent Vanity Fair 140 pages.
So
Yes.
how many words was that?
Gosh, I'm not, maybe, I'm not actually sure. I could look right now, I guess.
Like
Um,
100,000 or
I think it was 50,000. Let me
50,000? Yeah.
see.
Well,
Yeah.
that's sort of I think that that's a reasonable size for a book. I mean, I'm trying to remember what Kindle's minimum size is. Is it 50,000 words? Where they consider, don't they consider a novel to be 50,000 words minimum, something like that?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
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 So why are there none of your books available yet on Kindle unless I'm missing something?
Oh, it's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I guess none of my previous books have been successful enough to warrant a Kindle variant, to
Because
be
it's
honest.
very interesting where you coming from and where I'm coming from. I mean, I actually came into writing books through magazine journalism, and our very first book was actually a long form article where someone
Mm,
convinced me, someone sort of So I sent this long form article. It was about 16,000 words, and the magazine said they were going to publish it, but then they strung me along, and eventually I was just going to put it in the drawer or give it away. In fact, I actually did give it away to another author. Just say, well, you used it, whatever, whatever. And he was going to. It's the guy who wrote Rafa.
Mm.
Um, she can't even remember his name now. Carlin or anyway. And then something happened and I changed my mind. I said, sorry, deal's off. And then I ended up, so my first book on Kindle was a long form magazine article, and I was just astonished. Wow, like sold every single day, and I was like, wow, that's incredible. And then my second book was just a collection of unpublished magazine articles on the Oscar Pistorius case that then also sold like incredibly. I was like, maybe I should actually write a book now. The
Yeah.
first two books weren't books; they were just really collections of writing. And then that's how it sort of started. And I was like, okay, well, let's get going. And then that's how it sort of went on. But the part that sort of astonished me was everything sold on Kindle. Everything was only Kindle. And the sort of reason I went that route was you could turn around very, very quickly. You could, I mean, or I could, you could sort of write, edit it, do it to magazine quality, and have it all up and running in super quick time.
Yeah.
Whereas if you were going the other route, you were definitely going to be adding days or weeks to that whole process. And now, years later, I'm selling paperbacks. They're doing quite well, but the Kindles are still, I mean, it's not only people buying one unit on Kindle, but also the unlimited side. I don't know if you're aware of that, the pages read and so on. I mean, it really rewards good writing. If you're a good writer, then people go through the pages. Now, and I did have a little bit of a trick with my writing, giving you away trade secrets here. But I mean, I think it's inevitable in true crime that you leave um, the climax for the end. You leave like the situation for the end. And I mean, you do need to, as you research and you're finding more and more out. And so by the time you do get to the end, you've got a reasonable idea of what happened and who the people are. But what works with Kindle is um, they want to get to that end place. So you don't somehow reveal that before, but I mean it's the natural part of the story that what happens in the end happens in the end. So the reader's got to get to the end as well, right?
Yeah.
And so it definitely kind of works in that sense. But I mean, I must say, I think you should definitely think about going the Kindle route. It's just so easy to have those options, and something I've been doing not by Audible but just narrating my own books.
Oh, cool.
Um, but I do it on Patreon. So that is also like, do you wait until it's all perfect, which is what I would have liked to have done? And also, I wanted to get published the way you have with proper publishers and all that kind of thing. But then it was like, how long do you wait? And I mean, I did actually publish this book with a, can you see it? This book with an
Yes.
American publisher, but it took 2 years.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was just like true crime. I need to turn this around. And I'd publish a book and someone would say, when's the next one coming out? And that's something that's changed that I don't think a lot of people have realized. I don't know what your feelings are in terms of the vaccine with COVID, but people thought there's no way a vaccine can come out in whatever time. But publishing's the same thing, where you'd say that's impossible. You can't bring this out so quickly. But
Yeah.
computers, technology, society has changed to an extent that it almost demands it. It demands speed.
Yeah.
So so when you said you wrote out 140 pages, sort of like that, that's exactly what true crime demands. Because I mean, the true crime community are voracious, they're addicted, they are kind of insatiable. But at the same time, I must say, your article, and I don't say this lightly, your article's the best I think that I've read. Obviously, not everyone's trying to write a narrative. So someone for Fox News isn't trying to write the whole narrative. and very few people actually have. But your narrative, even so, stands out as a very concise, cohesive, integrated, but also, to do all of that and then write it well. That takes special talent. So well
Well,
done.
thank you. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate it. I I it means a lot coming from you, and I think that the thing that I realized with Gabby Petito and the coverage of her case and her social media and all of those things is that um, when we report cases by interviewing the victim's family, for instance, or their friends or their enemies, we take those stories and we publish them, and we take for granted that they are true and they become part of the narrative, even though, of course, like, memory is a tricky thing. People don't actually Someone who might not actually know the victim comes forward and says they did. I was her friend from high school, or here's what I thought
Mm,
about her. And I think so often people sort of dismiss um, social media reporting, like what a person said on Facebook or what a person posted on Instagram, because it's superficial. And so there's this onus on saying like, well, Gabby posted on Instagram XYZ instead of saying Gabby thought. Then Gabby did, like, describing it as
mm,
action and interior, conflict and all of those things. And so what I did was I wanted to report a story on her that used only internet sources but never mentioned the internet. And
yeah.
I think that's a little bit where, like, the intimacy comes from, because
Mm,
Gabby's own parents could not agree on whether or not she was engaged to Brian. But Gabby had, for instance, like, a folder in her Pinterest that was her dream home. So we could
mm.
see her hopes and dreams and desires um, right there in front of us. And I don't think it's any more superficial or any less credible than, an interview with a family that is grieving and wants the world to think the most of their child.
It is an irony that you have social media sometimes revealing sides to someone in a more insightful way than their own family do. Something I was just thinking about today was, while I was walking my dog, I was just thinking, is there something that's unspoken about? She kind of had four parents, and so wasn't there a thought somewhere through all of that that maybe it's not such a good idea that she goes on this trip to begin with, given the kind of person that she is, given the relationship that seems to be quite well known, that she had a toxic relationship with Brian. Her school friends knew that.
Mhm.
Even the park ranger seemed to sense that within a few minutes. And so you kind of wonder, didn't her parents, or what was her parents' view on that, or did Gabby do a very good job at sort of keeping that
Mm, mhm.
aside?
Well, that's really interesting. One of the things that really struck me about Gabby's family and having 4 parents is, and I'm this way too. My parents had me, and then they got divorced and had other families. And Gabby was the only child of her parents. They had her very young, and then they broke up and they started other families. So she was one of 6, technically.
Mm,
But she was going back and forth between these 2 houses, and she was always the visitor, whereas her siblings lived in these homes and they had these nuclear families. And I think that Gabby's life was a little like, family life was lonely, because you can imagine what it might feel
mm.
like to always be the visitor in your own home and moving back and forth. And so that was something that struck me when I was thinking about the fact that she does have 4 parents, and so many siblings, and yet she was isolated in a way.
I think another aspect is, who was her parent? Like, when you've got four parents, like, who is actually the main parent? And I think the obvious answer is Nicole, but it becomes a bit confusing to everybody. It's like, who is actually in charge here? And at the same time, Gabby's individuating, she's sort of growing up. It's like, I want to get married. I mean, at some point, as a parent, you do have to sort of say, I'm not going to be so hands-on. My child
Mhm.
doesn't want me to be hands-on anyway. So it's in that sort of muddiness of who's in charge, and should I still be a parent? Do I let my child grow up? And then, in that gray area, you have this terrible thing taking place, right?
Absolutely. And I don't think that Nicole or Joe really felt like they had a leg to stand on when it came to telling Gabby that she was too young to get engaged, because by her age, they had had a child. And
Mhm.
so they didn't really have a lot of authority in that way. You can't tell someone to not do what you did. She was already older than they had been when they had her.
To highlight something from your article, something that I thought was so insightful was this putting yourself in Brian's shoes, like kind of going, when you're going to post a picture of me, kind of thing. And you can imagine that's exactly what he's thinking. And it's like, it's the typical social media thing, me, me, me. Many years ago, before social media was anything like it is today, in fact, I'm now revealing my age, but I think it was actually even before social media. So long, long time ago, I went on like a cycling tour where we were like, I think we're 30 guys, students, and 30 girls. And I was a bit older than what they were, and I was sort of there as a quite a serious cyclist, but I was also there kind of as a journalist, and I thought I would record, kind of make a movie out of this whole adventure. We were riding about riding about 1,000 kilometers in about 8 days, and so I was recording all these little events and so on. And then I eventually did make a movie about it. And when you sat in the audience, and as I said, this is before social media, when you sat in the audience with 60 people and the sort of crew who are involved, you got the distinct feeling of, am I going to see myself? You know what I mean? And it's like in this situation, I know I was there. Is the camera going to go to me? How much attention am I going to get in this kind of situation? And it's an absolutely normal and natural narcissism, but you can suddenly feel incredibly slighted or incredibly complimented. You can get an incredibly big head one moment, and then the next feel, because of that fragility that you have at that age where your status is being kind of conjured from one moment to the next. And this is just in making this sort of student movie. Social media, it's like constant validation and invalidation. I think Gabby was getting constant validation, and Brian wasn't. Someone actually put up a question earlier. Just what did you think of their social media? And the question I had in line with that was, did you? So here it is from Bria. Bria is from France. Did you go into their social media so deeply that you saw comments made by friends? You know what I mean? Like if Gabby said something or Brian said something, that someone that actually knew them made some kind of response, because that's going into the social media fabric quite deeply.
Yeah. So before before Gabby's disappearance drew all of these new followers into her Instagram, she had fewer than 1,000 followers. It may have even been as few as like 300, and nobody followed Brian. And what I noticed is that there weren't a lot of there were a couple comments from like family friends and things like that, but she wasn't getting a lot of active engagement. And I think obviously, like, we know that if Gabby had lived, she probably would have become an influencer. She was headed in that direction. She was getting attention from brands. She was very, very pretty, very personable, very bubbly and charismatic, but she never really got to, I think, um, feel the kind of engagement that she would have liked to feel, the kind of engagement that didn't happen, ironically, until she was killed. Um, and I think Brian had a very tortured relationship with social media, because on one hand he had a lot of derision for it. You saw in his Instagram posts that he would often, talk about how bad the internet was, how screens were like evil, and yet he tried to use the internet to sell, unsuccessfully, to sell his, his bookmarks, his this and that.
Mm.
And so I think deep down he really did want to be seen online, but he hated that part of himself. And when he saw that part of himself that wanted to be seen online come alive in Gabby, I think that that was one extra layer in his growing resentment toward her.
So I put a image of the cover of your book, Slenderman, and what strikes me is how many things tie into the Petito case: online obsession, mental illness, which sort of came up in the Moab incident, violent crime, and then it's Gabby, but also to some extent the other characters like Rose, and did the Slenderman precede the Petito case?
Yeah, so the Slenderman stabbing happened in 2014, quite close to where I grew up in Wisconsin, and the part of the story that really roped me in was that the girls involved were all 12 years old. They were actually at a 12th birthday party, and and one of them had undiagnosed early onset childhood schizophrenia, which is one of the rarest forms of schizophrenia, but nobody knew about it. And she and her neighbor had decided that in order to keep Slender Man from killing them, they needed to kill Morgan, that's the girl with schizophrenia, to kill her best friend Bella. And so of course it became huge news, and all anybody was talking about was Slenderman and the number of stab wounds, 19 stab wounds. Bella survived somehow. Um, but I got interested in it because the state of Wisconsin, where I'm from again, proceeded to prosecute a mentally ill 12-year-old as an adult. So the book is this combination of two horror stories. One is the horror story of the stabbing, and the second um, half of the book is what happened after the girls went to jail. And it's very, very scary and frightening. And yeah, it's basically the crime, the true story of the crime, which has not been heard yet, uh, told very much from the villain's point of view, from Morgan's point of view, because I spent so much time talking to her and she told me her story. And so I decided to tell that story. I'm seeing Bria Lace is asking, which household did Gabby live in upon moving into Brian's parents' house? Which household? So prior to moving into Brian's parents' house, Gabby lived with Brian in one of the laundry's properties. It was quite nice, and it was not. They didn't have tenants at the time, so they let them live there for free. But what happened prior to the road trip is that Gabby and Brian were asked to move out because the laundries had decided to sell the property. And that meant that Gabby and Brian were going to move in with Brian's parents in the yellow house on Wabasso Avenue, which you guys have probably all seen. It's pretty small. I mean, it's not tiny, but it for 4 people. Um, it was probably a bit small. I felt a bit small, especially because when you're living with your parents when you're 23, it's an added layer of claustrophobia. And I think part of the reason that he expedited the road trip was not just that Gabby's dad had moved to to Florida, to be closer to Gabby, and he didn't like it when her family and friends were around. He wanted them all to go away, so that was part of it. And she was becoming close with Rose, who is bisexual, and I mean, I think from Brian's point of view, a beautiful new bisexual best friend was probably just maddening. But also, like, he was living with his parents, and he had his fiance in like a childhood bedroom that had a twin bed and Darth Vader stuff on the wall. And I think he was just becoming increasingly emasculated. And he's like, let's leave, let's go now, because anything to sort of distract from the fact that he couldn't give her the life that she wanted on Instagram.
Okay, I'm back. Why am I so big? How do I? Unfortunately, I've got like a pile of books sort of propping up my cameras. I would have looked behind them to see the dashboard, so it's kind of crazy. I'll obviously need to upgrade my setup here. So, Kathleen, do you want to read the Moab incident script that you have in the article, I kind of do you want to do that?
I would love to. Thank you so much. So this is the section that Nick chose, and I'm so glad he picked it because, people ask me all the time how I can stomach writing about such dark topics, and I feel like you guys are the only people who would probably relate to this, but violence stories don't turn my stomach. I mean, it's not as if they fill me with positive feelings. I'm not a sociopath, but I think I kind of like being scared, and I like horror. I watch horror movies. I read true crime. But this section was the hardest. It's the hardest piece of reporting I've ever done emotionally. Um, Writing about Gabby's tragic murder and like the specifics of about strangulation and stuff, which is also in the article, was easy compared to this. And this was actually the first time in my writing career where I felt nauseous and I had to stop reading. And it was not because the police stop was violent. It was not because there was anything, you know, like outwardly horror movie-ish about it, but I don't know, maybe the women in here can relate to this, or maybe it's universally relatable, but this traffic stop had so many relatable sexist microaggressions layered into it, and I not only had to watch both um, body cam footages. There's 2 of them. Both were very difficult to watch. Both were just like, "Oh my god, I can't believe that they're saying these things." But then I also read the 102-page investigation into the traffic stop, and the thesis, the conclusion of that investigation was that, yes, the police made a mistake, but they made a mistake because they were not harsh enough on Gabby. They should have arrested her. That was the conclusion. And in this investigation and in the traffic stop, a thing that happens a lot is the officers involved immediately compare Gabby to their children, sorry, their daughters and their wives, and that is like a common thing. Do any of the women here relate to this? It's like when men are being sexist, they will often bring up that they have a daughter, or they have a wife. They don't understand that comparing Gabby to their daughter to their wife is in and of itself problematic. They think that having a daughter automatically makes them a feminist. So I'm going off the rails a little bit here. I'm gonna read it, but just wanted to say that like people think that it must nauseate me to write true crime. It does not, but this particular piece of the story is pretty nauseating. So here we go. A month into their road trip, blistering heat, stinging flies, and unrelenting wildfire smoke were conspiring to drive Brian insane. Sleeping in a tent on account of the van's cramped quarters offered little protection from smoke inhalation, which is known to cause neurological issues like stress and confusion. Worse, Gabby's attention was divided between him and her phone as she generated content for Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok. That she had finally started posting pictures of Brian, along with loving captions, did little to lessen his anger. The whole point of the road trip in his mind was to isolate Gabby, but thanks to the internet, she was connected to the world. The tension between them first snapped on August 12th when Gabby retreated to an air conditioned coffee shop in Moab for 6 hours to toil on their van life website, while Brian seethed across the table, pissed off at how OCD Gabby was being. Finally, he snatched Gabby's phone and keys and made for the van, threatening to abandon her. When Gabby caught up with him on Main Street and lunged for her phone, Brian slapped her in the face. A passing driver saw the slap and called 911, watching as Brian slid into the van and started the engine. Somehow, before he could drive away, Gabby managed to wriggle across his lap into the vehicle. Who knows what they talked about, speeding out of Moab. Brian was driving at 45 miles per hour in a 15-mile-per-hour zone. It wasn't long before police lights flashed in their rearview mirror. As a result of the 911 call, police were on the lookout for a white van with Florida plates. Officer Daniel Scott Robbins, who was nearing the end of his police training, had been trailing the van for about a mile. He wondered aloud if the driver was intoxicated. Once Brian pulled onto the shoulder of the road, Robbins parked behind him and approached on foot. Gabby rolled down the passenger window, her face red and wet with tears, and apologized profusely. Brian smiled as if nothing was wrong. "How come you're crying?" Robin asked Gabby. Brian eyed Gabby warily from the driver's seat. Some personal issues, she said. It was a long day, Brian interjected, talking so fast that Robbins would later ponder whether Brian might be on drugs, flies and stuff. Robbins invited Gabby to talk to him in private. She stood hunched near Robbins's squad car, unable to stop crying, already blaming herself for the altercation. It's just some days I have really bad OCD. It was unclear whether a doctor or Brian had diagnosed her with the disease. Sounding kind and patient, Robbins asked about the road trip. Gabby stood up a little straighter. She gestured at the van with both hands like a presenter on Wheel of Fortune. I quit my job to travel across the country. Suddenly her face crumpled, as if she might cry again, as if overwhelmed by the prospect of what she said next. I'm trying to start a blog, so I've been building websites and I've just been really stressed. She gazed up at the sky as if to keep the tears back with gravity, but he doesn't really believe that I could do any of it. Her voice quavered. He really stresses me out. Well, Robbins interjected, why don't we do this? Why don't I sit you down in the back seat of my car? Tears filled Gabby's eyes. The prospect of getting into a squad car terrified her. She seemed to think that she was in trouble. You're not in any trouble, Robbins promised, but then he amended himself. I'm not going to be putting handcuffs on you. The mention of handcuffs made it seem as if Gabby were in fact in trouble. Not enough trouble to require handcuffs, but trouble nonetheless. As more squad cars pulled up behind them, Robbins shut her in the back of his police cruiser, the same place where criminals sat. Staring through the unbreakable divider, Gabby would not have been able to open the door from the inside. The notion that she was not in any trouble was understandably in question for her as she watched Robbins approach her beloved white van to talk to Brian. Brian leaned forward nervously in his seat, talking to Robbins through the passenger window. You talked to Gabby, right? Brian asked, one of his thick eyebrows vaulted above the other. He wrung his fingers in knots, looking afraid. Robbins left him hanging. Let's go ahead and get you to step out of the vehicle, all righty? Moments later, Robbins questioned Brian on the roadside. You want to tell me about those scratches on your face? Brian had two tiny red cuts, one up on his right temple, about a centimeter in length, and one underneath his right eye, the size of a pinprick. She gets really worked up sometimes, Brian said. What happened this morning was that she was trying to set up a little website blog. He mimed typing. So I gave her time. We really had a nice morning, but she just got worked up as we were trying to get going. She had a cell phone in her hand. That's why I was pushing her away. Robbins didn't ask why Gabby's cell phone provoked pushing, or why Brian would lock Gabby out of a van that was registered in her name. I know I shouldn't push her, Brian said. A male park ranger had joined them by this point, and Brian turned to him beseechingly. I was just trying to push her away to go, let's just take a minute, step back and breathe. He pointed at the scratches on his face. She got me. When Robbins headed back to his vehicle, he found Officer Eric Pratt, a big man with a beard, talking to Gabby. Did he hit you, though? Pratt was asking. Gabby cried, indicating that he had, but she had hit him first, she claimed. Her account did not match the 911 callers, but the men had not listened to the 911 call. They decided that Gabby had been the primary aggressor in her altercation with Brian. Pratt joined Brian at the van, pointed a jaunty finger at him, and announced, You are the victim of domestic assault, causing Brian to laugh out loud.
Okay,
Pratt,
can I
yeah.
stop you there? Well, first of all, just to allow you a chance to catch your breath, but
It's a long
also
section.
to address the question in the poll, which is who was the primary aggressor, right?
Yeah.
And I've kind of I actually wanted to have this up before this live because it would have sort of gone into the live. I did a deep dive number 8. I don't know if you know, Kathleen, I've done about 7 deep dives on the Moab incident, each one about 2 minutes. It might sound like it's not a lot, but you probably know that there's a lot of detail in every couple of seconds, right? When you play it over and over again, more and more sort of unfolds, more subtlety and more detail. And when I did the research for deep dive number 8, I think it deals with 20 minutes into the first body cam, up to about 23 minutes, 30 seconds or so. But that's exactly the part that you talk about around about this point in your article where they basically decide Gabby's the primary
Yeah.
aggressor. And then to me, it's just so well done the way you describe at that point. They go and tell Brian this. And at that point, the park ranger, Melissa Holmes, is actually talking to Gabby, and they just walk straight by her. They don't. She's on their way to them going to Gabby. They're two men, and both men bypass her. And I think they could have consulted her as well. They could have said, what has Gabby told you? And also, in other words, um, in the place of that confirmation bias, in the place of that sexism, speak to someone who is the same sex as Gabby to start off with. We know now that subsequently that Melissa had a different view, right? And she was almost like the most silent person there. You know what I mean? And then, of course, you say this so well. I think it's also quoting somewhat from the report, but also from reality, where you say they then walk to Brian and say, you're a victim of domestic violence. And Brian bursts out laughing.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how ridiculous it actually is.
Yeah, it's so ridiculous that he found it funny. And
Yeah.
the shocking element, I mean, that in and of itself is so shocking. But you know, they only asked Gabby if Brian had hit her. They never asked Brian if he had hit Gabby. They asked Gabby if she had hit Brian. They didn't ask him about slapping her at all. They didn't question him once. They didn't take She had injuries too, and they didn't take pictures of her injuries. They only photographed Brian's, and they lost the pictures that they did take. And he was not making any sense. He was If you watch it, he's all over the place, talking so fast that Officer Robbins asks him if he's on any medications because he's kind of hyper. Um, and later in their police reports, you learn that they decided that Gabby was, I mean, for lack of a better word, crazy because she couldn't stop crying. And
Mhm.
it's just, I mean, yes, they should have asked the female park ranger to question her. They should have asked the female park ranger what she thought. But like on a bigger sort of the bigger issue is why wasn't there any training in domestic violence? Why wasn't there someone there who might have been able to translate, because she was exhibiting so many symptoms of someone who is abused, and they just completely railroaded her. And it was a boys club moment in ways that I've like never
Yeah.
really seen before.
Half Ratter, thanks a lot. Just saying thanks for the greatness of the guest and chat, 5 stars.
Oh, thanks, brother.
Someone else said something here about Brian's nervous laughter, but to me, it's really bizarre how the officers lost the footage that they captured. They
Yeah.
take the footage, and then how do you end up losing it? Something else that I think they offered Brian medical assistance or something, and they didn't offer Gabby that, right?
Mhm.
Something I mentioned in my deep dives was because Gabby was sitting where she was sitting in the cruiser, the side of her face that was actually injured was constantly facing away from them. You know what I mean? And also the side of her arm that was also injured was also facing away from them. And if you think about it, when Gabby was sitting next to Brian, the side facing Brian was the
Mhm.
side where she got injured, kind of thing.
That's really, really interesting. Yeah, so it was her left side, so when he hit the curb, you're saying that maybe because she said that she punched him and that's why he hit the curb, but maybe he was swinging at her as well in the front seat as he was driving.
Yeah. Something I thought you captured quite well, and someone criticized this aspect, just saying, what about the fact that Gabby hit Brian and all that kind of thing? But
Yeah.
what I think is missing from that debate, I mean, that's accurate. Gabby did hit Brian, and there's a little bit of a Johnny Depp Amber Heard thing, kind of argument. But the part that I think a lot of people are missing is, why are the officers there in the first place? Like,
Yeah.
what? is the reason we are here? What are we actually investigating? And the answer is somebody called 911 and they said twice. Basically, they said, we saw a gentleman, strange word to use, we saw a gentleman hitting, I don't know if it was a girl or a female, and then also, a gentleman slapping the girl, and then after that, and then he hit her. So it's kind of double confirmed. That's the call that led to them going out. So investigate that. And the question should be, Brian, did you hit Gabby? Yes
Yeah.
or no?
Yeah.
Gabby, did Brian hit you? Yes or no? That should really
Yeah.
be the question. It ends up being, in a way, it's unfortunate. Gabby's saying, yes, but I hit him first. And then the officers take that as their cue, right?
Yeah, and that's sort of how we discuss these things, right? Like who hit who, whose fault is it? But the thing that I sort of kept coming back to when I was thinking about this particular incident as a prelude to the murder is Brian slapped her in the face. This is like verified by two independent witnesses, and in public, in broad daylight on a sidewalk. So if that's appropriate for public behavior, what's going on in private? And with domestic violence, sometimes there is mutual violence going on. You know, there's things get physical on both sides, but who's going to win? Who's going to win that fight here? It's definitely not going to. Maybe Gabby slapped Brian. Okay, fine, she pushed him, but if that's an ongoing fight, who's going to win? A girl who weighs 110 pounds, or a guy who used to be 40 pounds overweight, and because of that experience has since, over the course of his lifetime, devoted himself to being strong, muscular, toned. Every day he's working on his body, and I don't know if you guys have seen his hands, but they were enormous. Like she never stood a chance. And a lot of domestic violence calls, abused women end up getting arrested and sent to jail because they fought back and they admit to it, and that becomes the focus of the investigation, not the fact that they were being abused. It's sort of like, well, you hit them, so what did you expect? Of course they're gonna, like, strangle you, or so. Yeah, so I think that the fact that Gabby pushed him, slapped him, whatever, I don't think it changes the fact that uh, this traffic stop could have been handled differently, and if it had been, she might still be alive.
Yeah, I must say, the sort of strange result of all of this analysis, like when you look at the Moab incident, what should have happened is Gabby probably should have been detained, but at the
Yeah,
same time, Brian. I mean, in other words, what actually went wrong here was the sympathy that the officers had for them. And I've got to say, if I was in that situation, I think I would have been sympathetic as well. But the problem with that whole thing is, you say Gabby's crying and Gabby's emotional. Is that Gabby being weird? Is that Gabby's anxiety, or is that actually an authentic, appropriate response to what she's going through? If you join the dots to Gabby crying at the roadside, emotional, distressed, and actually injured, and you tie that and you link that dot on the August the 12th to August 27th, and she's murdered,
yeah,
then you say, oh, was Gabby overly emotional? Was Gabby
mhm,
inappropriately emotional? Or do you say, was Brian inappropriately, whatever, smiling, fist pumping, lying,
lying,
manipulating,
yeah,
all those things, right?
yeah,
And I think what's a bit unfortunate was that Gabby sort of defended Brian, like,
mhm,
did Brian hit you? Well, I hit him first. And I think that is where it gets quite difficult for so if the victim um, doesn't really accuse the perpetrator, what do you do with that? Do you know what I mean?
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's where you do not get emotional, sympathetic, and have again, to come back to the original thing, what are you doing as officers? Well, somebody saw Brian hit her, and now
yeah,
she is crying. Isn't that because he did hit her?
right,
And another thing that I think is really missing from the whole debate, and it's unfortunate that the officers didn't know this. But again, how on earth would they guess this? Is basically it was Gabby's van.
Yeah.
It's Gabby's van, and Brian's locking her out of it, and this, that, and the next thing. Um, so, if you see it from that perspective, if you have some kind of domestic disturbance and it's your house, so if it's your house and you ask someone to leave, you kind of have that authority. Do you know what I mean? Whereas
Yeah,
if,
absolutely.
yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that was another sort of micro sexist assumption by the police officers, right? This is a man, he's driving the van, it must belong to him. And if they had asked any questions about it, they would have had a different view, I think, of the fact that he tried to leave Gabby behind on Main Street and basically steal her van. I mean, that's another layer
mm,
to it as well. Unfortunately, blaming oneself for the abuse is a symptom of domestic violence. And
yeah.
so it becomes a very tricky thing, as you're saying, to untangle and prosecute if the victim is insistent on holding themselves accountable for what happened.
You also get a sense that these are police officers, and you would think that one of their functions, one of their roles is being able to discern is someone telling the truth. And although Officer Pratt, I thought, did that quite well, where he sort of said, but did he hit you? And he was sort of, he was definitely focused on that. But there was another area where Brian told Officer Robbins, what if she leaves me and I don't have a phone? I'm going to be stranded. And then the next thing, his phone comes out. It's like,
Yeah.
wow, that you weren't honest with me. What's that all about? And the
Yeah.
other thing that was quite strange, although this interferes with the original reason that they're there, Officer Robbins sort of experiences in person Brian actually fleeing the scene. Brian's not a good guy. He's not obeying the law. And then if you think of it just in join the dot of the Moab incident to Spade Creek Camp, you have a situation where Gabby's telling Brian to stop doing something in order to obey the law. In other words, um, the police are coming after us. You need to stop. And she's got to actually hit his arm or whatever it is. You might say she shouldn't hit him, but she's actually acting in sort of, he needs to, there's a cop car behind them, pursuing them. What is Brian trying to do? And you kind of think, does Brian have a guilty conscience that he doesn't want to have this confrontation with the police because what is he going to say? But
Yeah.
one thing that he seems not to be doing is like obeying the law. It's like the police behind you, okay, I'll slow down and stop. Gabby's kind of got to force him, and then you think, Jeepers, what is wrong with you? Right?
Yeah.
And then you also wonder with the police, like, couldn't they even have given him a fine for that because he did something wrong there? You know,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah, they really related to him as well. I mean, you see them projecting, both Robbins and Pratt projecting their own experiences with their wives onto the situation. Pratt and Robbins both share stories with Brian that make them compassionate toward him, I guess, about how anxious their wives are, how their wives need medication, how, like, I mean, like, the subtext of these conversations of them sharing about their own marriages is just that women are crazy and
mm,
we're here for you, man.
yeah.
And they couldn't sort of like untangle what was happening in front of them from their own view of women who are crying. And like you said, like, you can imagine, getting slapped in the face by someone that you're intimate with, um, on the street in front of people, and then they turn and they try to steal your car, and you jump in the car and you go after them, and next thing you know, the police are there and
Yeah.
they're interrogating you. I mean, like, they were interrupting Gabby. They were not listening to what she had to say. She was in the back of a squad car and she got in trouble. Like, she got in trouble. So you can imagine getting slapped and then almost arrested for getting slapped might make you very upset, might make you cry. And that seems like a pretty
Mm.
appropriate response to the situation, actually.
If you think of what Gabby said to them. So if you think about, the cops are there to, I mean, it reminds me again of Depp versus Heard. It's like, this whole case is about defamation. What we don't want to do is have someone defamed. We want to protect someone's right to reputation. And then on the internet, everyone is insulting and defaming, basically. So it's like, the point of all this is that you protect someone's right to their reputation. Now, if you take the Gabby Petito thing, it's like, this whole thing is about, we want to protect the person whose life is in danger. That's why we're here. We thought someone hurt someone else, and we're here to make sure that someone doesn't get hurt. You know, it's like kindergarten policing. My job as a policeman is to make sure that a person doesn't get hurt. And then during the whole discussion, and I want to come back to your narrative. We must definitely make sure we complete it. But during the whole, talking to Gabby, talking to Brian, Gabby makes a major sort of concession, and they've got to sort of drag it out of it, where it's kind of where the officer says, "But did he hit you?" And she says, "Well, he actually kind of grabbed my face," and she even demonstrates it, right?
Yeah.
That demonstration is actually huge. Even if she'd said, "Well, he did this," and then showed that. And,
Yeah.
if you take that again, it draws a dot from the Moab incident straight to Sweat Creek Camp, because that's exactly what he
Yeah.
did,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, he
And
put his
so,
hands on her neck.
yeah, and so it seems to me, and I don't know whether this was explicitly mentioned in that report. I mean, it's quite a long report, but what I would think needs to be quite explicit in that report is the same intuition you have as a writer, right? You kind of need to have as a cop, where you say, what is the insight here? So what is the thing that's not being mentioned, or what is the subtext to what we're talking about? And to me, the answer is, well, let's put it this way. To me, the question was, Gabby, did Brian hit you? Yes or no? Answer, no. Brian, did Gabby hit you? Answer, yes. Okay, so the problem is that Gabby hit Brian. It's like, okay, but there are other forms of violence here as well.
Yeah,
I
that's a
mean,
really good point.
and the really, the one that trumps all of them is putting your hand at, this part of a person and actually injuring them. That's not like pushing someone. Brian was like, "Oh, I just pushed her away," you know
Yeah.
and that is, I think part of the reason why Gabby actually felt traumatized and tearful was that was like quite a frightening thing. You can imagine there was this emotionally fraught, intense moment where Brian's face is right in front of hers, and he's got his hand on her face. That's not a
Yeah.
friendly gesture. It's also not a flippant or a casual gesture. It's an aggressive thing. And also
Yeah.
what you said in your piece, which is quoting, I think it was Michael, where it said, Brian would quickly lose his temper. That's something that I think was also not acknowledged, was that Brian lost his temper during the Moab incident. And then he
Mhm.
covers that by seeming to be laughing and casual and all of that kind of stuff. And that's another nuance where they could have said, did your boyfriend lose his temper? What kind of guy is your boyfriend? And they touched on it a little, where she said, yeah, he's irritated. He doesn't think I can do anything with my blog and so on. So that they touched on those dynamics a little bit. Um, but yeah, the fact that she demonstrated him grabbing her face, and grabbing her face actually means grabbing this sort of part, her neck, her throat,
Yeah.
her jaw. What is that? It's silencing, it's constricting, it's suffocating, it's shutting down. That is actually a far more dangerous and red flaggy thing than hitting someone. Hitting someone can be just a quick lashing out. There's far more intent in grabbing someone in that way, because that is control, that is intentional, that is power. That's a power thing. And if you think about it, just that basic question, who is the most powerful person and who's exerting power in that situation? Answer, Brian,
Mhm.
Brian, Brian.
Mhm.
You know?
Yeah. Yeah, 100%.
Stargirl says, I think he was very reactive and oversensitive.
Mhm. I think you're right. I think she's right.
Okay, so let's go on to reading the rest while we've still got some
Okay,
time.
cool. Okay. Um, okay. So Pratt joined Brian at the van and announced, "You are the victim of domestic assault." Brian laughed out loud. Pratt, citing the importance of being anti-sexist, because women can victimize men too, quickly enlisted Robbins, an inferior ranking officer, to get Brian a hotel for the night. His room would be paid for by Seek Haven, the local women's shelter. Gabby could sleep outside. Before leaving Gabby alone in the wilderness, Robbins asked whether she had any messages of love to convey to Brian, coaxing, "Want me to let him know that you love him and that you'll see him tomorrow?" Gabby didn't answer. In a squeaky voice, rusty from tears, she said, "Make sure he doesn't forget a phone charger." Back at the van, Brian seemed psyched about the hotel, gushing to a male park ranger, "Thank you, thank you." "She does have a couple messages for you," Robbins said, putting words in Gabby's mouth. "One, she says she loves you. She's looking forward to seeing you tomorrow. Two, don't forget a cell phone charger." Brian grinned at this and laughed to himself. The subtext seemed clear. Women are nags, but what would we do without them? We'd never remember the stupid little things. Our homes or vans would be a mess. "You're going to be in a hotel room watching TV," Robbins congratulated Brian. "It's probably been a few months since you actually got to sit down and relax." Before driving into the wilderness by herself, Gabby asked Robbins if she could know where Brian would be staying that night, since she would need to collect him in the morning. When Robbins said he couldn't reveal the location of the hotel, Gabby began crying. "I just don't usually drive the van, so I want to make sure it's not like far," she said. Brian had been making Gabby feel dependent on him. The van was registered in her name, but in her mind, she could not safely drive her own vehicle. Robbins walked Gabby to her van, taking a meandering route so that she and Brian would not interact. In her arms, Gabby cradled the bottled waters that police had given her. "Something I want you to know," Robbins said, telling Gabby the location of some place she could shower for like $4 or $5. "It does my wife wonders when she gets stressed out." He pantomimed yelling at his wife. "It's like, get in the shower. Come on, get in the shower." What was Gabby supposed to say to this? Her face was red. She looked thirsty and scared. Perhaps she was remembering that the bottled waters she cradled were forbidden. Brian hated plastic. As Robbins drove Brian to the hotel, the two agreed that women can be difficult. Robbins told Brian about being on the road with his wife back when he was still a trucker, how as time went on, the humongous semi had started to feel like, quote, "an 8x8 cage." Brian commiserated. "Gabby got up on his nuts sometimes too. Like I'm trying to paint or something or make myself a snack," he started. "Well, that was one of the major advantages of having her with me," Robbins interrupted, returning to his wife. "Because I was driving and she wasn't, she was able to go back, get in the cooler, make us lunch or whatever, you know? So there was that as an advantage." The Bowen Motel offered creature comforts like cable television and an outdoor heated pool. Brian's stay there would cost the local women's shelter around $150. According to its website, Seek Haven refused to house men at its physical location and only provided financial resources to men in what the shelter called emergency situations. During his questioning of Gabby, Pratt recorded himself saying to Gabby, "There is two people saying they saw him punch you." Prior to blaming herself, a common occurrence among victims of abuse, Gabby confirmed that Brian hit her. But when Pratt filed his paperwork about the incident, he explicitly wrote, "No one reported that the male struck the female." An investigation would later confirm that Pratt filed an erroneous report. He identified Gabby as the primary aggressor and blamed the altercation on her, quote, "serious anxiety." "She was struggling with her mental health," Robbins agreed in his report. "At no point in my investigation did Gabrielle stop crying, breathing heavily, or compose a sentence without needing to wipe away tears." Perhaps another cop would stop to wonder whether getting slapped, then interrogated about it, and eventually labeled the aggressor might have caused Gabby's distress. But Robbins proceeded to diagnose Gabby as being in a manic state, when in reality it was Brian who had been so excitable that Robbins had commented on it, asking if Brian was always so hyper and whether he took any medications. Ultimately, Robbins seemed to discredit Gabby's statements solely because they conflicted with Brian's, writing at one point that Brian's version of events was not consistent with Gabrielle's statement, further suggesting her confused and emotional state. After evaluating the totality of the circumstances, I do not believe the situation escalated to the level of a domestic assault as much as that of a mental health crisis. Thank you so much for everything, Brian gushed to Robbins in the hotel lobby. No problem. Nice to meet you, Brian. Have a good one, Robbins said.
Come back
Yes,
home.
Lisa. His room was paid for by the local women's shelter. The police made sure of it.
Kathleen, have you narrated any of your books so far?
No, I haven't. I just got news that Slenderman is going to be on Audible, and I specifically said, have one of your amazing voice actors do it because, yeah,
No, you should. You should.
well, you have a great narrating voice,
No, no, no,
but
no, no. No, I've got to tell you, and I'm not trying to be funny. I'm not trying to whatever, but your voice, not only in terms of your own narrative, but the narrative for the Petito case, I think is really appropriate. I mean, you're not an old woman. You know what I mean? You're an American, but I'm just saying your voice as a you almost you kind of to me look like and sound like and seem representative of almost like an older, wiser Gabby. You know, the Gabby that Gabby could have grown up to be, writing back to in time, but almost in a you know what I mean, like in a wise, the sort of wiser, older version of oneself, kind of thing. And just the tone of your voice has got the sort of ring to it that fits the Petito story. I must say, definitely, it resonates just from a gut feel perspective.
thank you so much. I don't know if you saw on Vanity Fair, but they had someone narrate it if people want to listen to it instead to the article. And I thought she did a really, really good job. I feel I feel so much of this project was just trying to, we didn't get to see Brian held accountable in any way. He was never really he never had to face the repercussions of his behavior in any area of his life. And so much of this for me was just trying to um, seek some justice for her. I really just like came to feel so much compassion for her as like as a mom myself, and she just she was a really special person. She was a kind-hearted, hardworking stoner who loved to laugh, and I think anyone who watches Rose's videos of her will see that. And Brian was so self-serious,
Mm.
and he tricked her into thinking that he was an artist, and ironically, like, he was the not had did not have an artistic personality at all. He was an authoritarian, rigid, I think
Not
you
very
mentioned
sensitive.
yesterday.
Yeah,
Yeah,
doesn't
not
have
very
that.
sensitive.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can see you sort of dodged that thing a little bit. You sort of took it away. I don't want to like sound self-indulgent, but um, I'd written quite a few books, and I got more and more requests. I don't read, or I don't want to read. I don't want to read your book. I want to hear your book. I prefer the audio version. In terms of my preference to consume your book would be an audio book. And then I took that quite seriously, and I started doing research, and I started getting prices for people. And so I went into it quite far, and I went as far as paying voice artists, and it was quite expensive. And I actually had someone narrate this book that I quickly showed you, the one that I published, this one. And I thought it was fantastic. It was this Canadian with a really baritone voice, and he did these other voices so well. And the feedback I got totally astonished me. They were like, "We don't want to hear someone else. We want to hear you. We want to hear your voice." And I thought, "Yeah, but I'm a South African. You're an American." And they were like, "We still want to hear your words in your voice." And although I totally understand where you're coming from, because to me it's like well, I did write this and I do know what I mean, but I think someone else would be, you do get fantastic voiceover artists. But what I think you forget is that the reader on the other side um, has gotten to know you through your words, and they've gotten familiar through your words, and they see your face. And then some completely different person, a third party, comes along and they then assume your voice. And they don't actually have, in a way, they don't have any clue what you've written about. They just come superficially and add a voice to it. And
Right.
there's something very authentic about an author reading their own words. I mean, it's definitely that. And although it's totally different, I was I started off being very shy and withdrawn and kind of embarrassed. Like, I don't want to be on YouTube. I want my words to speak for themselves, and all that. And I was quite astonished when people were like, "We love listening to your audiobooks," and
Mm.
all that kind of thing. And so there definitely is a place for that. And so, although I kind of sense that you've got a very professional thing going on and you probably have access to fantastic voiceover artists, you can also, if you listen to the chat afterwards, have a look at how many people will say, well, we don't actually want to hear anyone else. We want to hear you reading your words. And even when you were reading them, I was thinking this would make a great audiobook, just exactly the way it is. And then when you think, oh well, but someone else is going to read it, it's like, damn,
Yeah.
Um,
Well, thank you so much. I mean, it's really fun. It's really interesting and fun to hear that you were shy about starting a YouTube channel because when I see you on YouTube, I just think like this person has always been super comfortable or whatever, because I consider myself to be kind of shy. So it's a really interesting backstory. Thanks for sharing that.
Someone else just says your own voice comes through your own heart and mind. And I think it is important for an author, um, like that. Something I actually wanted to ask you, now that we sort of through the narration part, we can sort of go into the writing part a little bit. um, yeah, so what did I want to ask you? Well, the one question I want to ask is, are you a full-time writer?
I am. I'm very, very lucky and grateful to be a full-time writer right now. I have not always been a full-time writer. Now I am. I write books. I also write for television. That's something that I do as well that I love. And so yeah, it's it's a dream come true to be able to you know make money
Yeah.
doing what you would otherwise do.
You write for Netflix, you've written for Vice, and you've written for The Guardian, which is a British publication, right?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, it's it's I love it so much.
So to read your bio, it says Kathleen Hale is the author of 2 young adult novels. It's actually 3, isn't it?
No, two, and then one essay collection.
And
Yeah.
Slender Man,
Yes, and Slenderman, which is forthcoming.
which is not young adult, it's true crime, right?
It's true crime. That's right.
Something tells me you're gonna stick with true crime. Something tells me true crime's going to become a thing. Um,
Yes, I definitely feel like I never want to stop doing this. It's the I I've liked writing in every medium, but like when I got to this, I was like, this is where my head is at. This is where I want to always be.
do you like writing for television?
I do. I really like it. It's a nice balance to writing books because when I write books, I'm alone. It's a very solitary exercise. And with TV
Mm.
writing, they have these things called writers' rooms where it's you and a team of like 5 to 12 other people sitting in a room and using your imaginations and collaborating and coming up with characters and episodes and what's going to happen next. And it's incredible to be it almost feels like being on a sports team kind of. Yeah, not that I have a sports background, but it's like everybody's sort of, vibing off of each other and to be around other creative people when you spend most of your time in a closet at a computer, typing in the dark,
Mm.
uh, like a serial killer is refreshing.
Yeah, well, I've got to tell you, you must be like, I don't know what's going on with this guy. How do you write 100 books? Like, what is going
Yes,
on? Like,
yes.
is this like the multiverse? Like, did you
Yeah.
go and have alternate selves or something? Um, but I've got to tell you, I worked so much, so long, and so hard that I actually started. It started the shape of my spine started changing. When I would lie down on my bed, I was kind of in this hunched position, and I'd sort of it would take a while for my spine to sort of do you know what I mean, like
Yeah.
un unclench or whatever, you know. I would get like a crick in my neck, and I would kind of go like this to kind of uncrick it, just from writing. Like it totally, even now, I was sort of a Ironman triathlete, and I did quite a few half Ironmans as well. And I'm still trying to transform back into that person, but my whole writing became, I've turned into this writing monster, and I'm trying to untransform out of it. Like Stephen King talks about, the monster grabs you and won't let go of you. Well,
Yeah.
I've kind of kicked the monster to the curb, but I'm still in sort of remission.
Yeah. The monster is inside of you.
Yeah. So this is quite a personal question, and I'm asking it to some extent from my own personal experience. But I mean, I've written since I was at school. I've written a huge amount. I've got lots of books that are, even though I've written and published 100 books, I've got easily 10, 15 books that are half written or quarter written or whatever it is. Um, and to me, I think there's something in the artist. I think a proper writer is also an artist, someone who conjures with words and so on. But isn't there something where there's a deep dissatisfaction with reality?
Mm. Yeah, I
And
think yeah.
and and what is that for you? Because I look at you, and you young, you attractive, you, not that it's like the being at the top of the pile, but you live in LA. And so what's not to where's the whatever, the dissatisfaction, the darkness? What's the source of that?
Well, I mean, it's such a great way of putting it, the dissatisfaction with reality. I find it very hard to come home, like I spend my day in my imagination, and to come home and to be in the real world is actually very physically uncomfortable for me. And so I completely identify with that description of being a writer. And yeah, I think that, I think that that throughout my life, people look at me and they think that I'm like a normal, sometimes they think I'm like a normal chill person, but I'm not at all. Like I'm I'm very weird, I'm very dark, I'm very obsessive. I relate very strongly to your fans who are in the chat, like, asking questions. Like, I feel like the chat under this video is my brain all the time, just wanting to be writing, wanting to be researching, wanting to be creating, and telling 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 stories. And I have two small children, and they're great and amazing. They also need me to be extremely present. So
Mm,
it's really shed a strong light for me on my own tendency to escape into my own mind, because that is my natural state. And with so and now I really have to go home. Like, it used to be before I had kids, I would write nights, I would write on the weekends. I was like always making things one way or another. And now I have to relax a little bit and be more present. And like you were saying, it can be strange sometimes to exist in reality when when your resting state, when your preferred state, when you're most calm in an imaginary world.
yeah. Um, I remember as a kid, and I'd be really interested to hear which authors you read as a very young person, as a teenager, as a young adult, and so on. But I remember as a kid, and it probably, in a weird way, set me up to write series of books. I mean, I've got some books that are 14 books in the series, and another one, whatever. And of course, Amazon also incentivizes that, like make a series kind of thing, it kind of asks you, because it's always easier to write another book in a series than try and find a completely new reader. You'll find that with true crime. And also with true crime, you write a book and then more information comes out and you're like, oh, jeepers, this changes things. And I'm the best person, but I'm a good person to have this conversation with this new information kind of thing. For example, if you have a trial and an appeal or whatever, it can change the narrative and you feel like, but that's not the narrative. That's not the actual story. And you'll find as a true crime writer, you are often the person who knows the story, if not the best, very, very well. And that's compared to lawyers, that's compared to experts, that's compared to other reporters in the media, because a reporter writes an article, they don't write the narrative. So all the narratives of all the reporters kind of thing, And it puts you it's like in that one Avengers movie where the guy says, I'm cursed with knowledge. It's like, you sort of feel like, cheapers, I know this and I've got to tell my people this. I've got to tell my community this. Otherwise, the fake narrative is going to take over. And you'll find as that continues, you get this terrible kind of conscience on behalf of the victim, on behalf of the narrative itself, to say, this is the real story.
Yeah.
And, please don't get sidetracked by this conspiracy or by that assumption or by that popular misconception. And then you kind of become this storyteller, but kind of in your own heart and mind that's actually got a important mission, and it's truth telling, but it's beyond that. It's like you are the custodian in a way, and you might become the custodian in a way of Gabby Petito's story. And you kind of bear responsibility to that, but you can either shoulder or not. You can say it's too much. I can't do this or whatever. Or you can say, I must, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And it's just a aspect, that's what makes true crime unique, is it's real lives, real nightmares, real catastrophes. It's reality that is being distorted and convoluted and interfered with. And that's also what I found really interesting and ironic with you, is your story is so well written. I'm talking about your article. It's so well written and it's so authentic and realistic. I saw someone saying something else where they said, and that does sometimes happen, you are interpreting and you are giving it you can call it spin, but on the other hand, you're also bringing everything together and trying to weave it in a way that works. And it will work for a lot of people. And for someone will say, are you a psychic? You weren't there. How do you know? But for another person, I'll say, wow, you transported me there. And that counts for something. When somebody takes all the information together and they take that upon themselves and they say, I want to write an authentic narrative, compared to someone else who's just like, well, I'm going to tell the story or I'm going to tell it gratuitously, The other thing that I wanted to ask you was, what was it? So you're going to think about at least narrating, just narrate once, see see how it goes.
Well, yeah. Now that you,
one of the obvious signs of a good narrative is when it reads well, when it's narrated, when you read it aloud. A well-written narrative reads aloud well. And one of the things that's so interesting about it, because I've been doing it, is sometimes you reading your own narrative aloud, and I'm sure you edit it, you reread it exhaustively, but sometimes you might come to it after the fact, and you might think it's just a little bit more elegant when I say it this way, and the writing is just a little bit, just slightly more effective with a little bit of maybe that word italicized, because that's how you would read it. And you're just putting a little bit more of you into the narrative, because sometimes the reader gets what you're saying, but when you narrate it yourself, you're like, that's the part I'm trying to emphasize. And it doesn't always read in that way compared to when you narrate it. And so, you can, that's another way that you can actually fine tune your narratives. So that is the hidden benefit to me when I narrate my own narratives. It's another chance to fine tune it,
Yeah.
to make
Yeah.
exactly the way I wanted on that final. It's one thing to read it silently and you go, okay, I'll do that. And that when you read it aloud, it forces you to slow down to the pace of the reader. And another thing that is so true for me in modern writing is when you narrate it, you realize I've only got so much time to narrate this chapter, then I need to do X, Y, and Z. Well, that's
Mhm.
exactly the predicament of your reader. So
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
realize what is the right chapter length
Mhm.
in terms of narrating it, you know.
Yeah,
And
that's a really
I
good
must say,
point.
from the time I started writing to now, chapters have gotten a lot shorter.
Yeah.
And in the beginning, I thought, bugger your attention span. You need to pay attention. You need to, but the reality is the reality, which is there's so many distractions, and people's times are limited. So it's
That's really smart. Yeah, no, I think that that's exactly right. I mean, shorter is always better, um, because things just get stronger the more that you condense them, like you're saying. And I'll definitely, take your advice to heart about narrating it. I think you're making really good points for sure.
okay. So I think what everyone wants to know is when is your. So far, we're not quite sure what the name is. Something
Yes.
about the dream. The book on
Yeah.
Gabby Petito. When's that likely to come out?
Well, it depends if publishers want it. I've sent out a proposal for the book, and I have probably three-quarters of it written. And so if the marketplace says yes, then it will exist. And I have a couple of title thoughts. One is Living the Dream. I'm not very good at titles, so I am also open to any pitches that anybody has for a good title for this. Um, Vanity Fair titled it in the print version Virtual Reality, and in a prior draft, they had titled it Into the Great Wide Open. So those are a couple of title ideas, but love to hear what you guys think.
I'm going to say something that's a little bit, you might think is a little bit nasty, but after we spoke, or after you interacted in the live and we were talking about titles, I kind of, just because I am a writer, I was thinking, what would be a good title? And then two titles kind of
Yeah.
jumped out at me where I was like, that resonates, that would work. And then I thought, I'd like to tell you what they are. And then I thought, but what if and I certainly don't intend to write for the next 7 years at least. I want to kind of like not write, but
Yeah.
almost like force myself not to write. But there's a possibility when I'm 60 or 70, I might be like, I need to write the Gabby Petito story. Then I might want
Yeah.
to rely on those titles. Hopefully, I'll remember them and not have dementia. But
Well, nobody owns titles. So if you give it to me and then you want it back later, you can take it, and I can't come after you. There would be two
the
books by
other
the same
side,
title, but
the other side of it is, if I never end up writing a book, then it could be a title that lives on beyond me. But I'm sure you're going to come up with a good title anyway. I must say I really like the books that you've written here. Let's just bring them up. Um, I like it's just so original, that sort of knitted cover. No One Else Can Have You. That's also a great title, and it's quite an ironic title given Brian Laundrie. It's quite an ironic
yeah,
title given that. And just so cleverly done, that sort of knitted thing with the reindeer sort of hanging there. It's sort of like humor, but dark humor.
thanks. Yeah, I was really happy about that cover when that came through. It's a dark book. It's a humorous dark book, kind of compared to like teenage YA Fargo is sort of the vibe.
Is that it's obviously fiction, right?
No One Else Can Have You is fiction. Yeah, it's part of a 2-book series, a young adult series, a murder
Is
mystery.
is it is there any foundation in fact?
Um, no, not with the crime. No.
Otherwise,
Well, I mean, I think I draw from my own experience and all sorts of things. I never was at the center of a murder case, but it's a book that's set in Wisconsin, and so some of the details about that and some of the details about the main character are definitely drawn from life.
because you're from Wisconsin,
I am, yeah.
and this other book, what on earth is that about?
So in 2014, I was writing sort of like slice of life first person essays. I don't know if you remember that time, but like confessional essays, as they were called when women wrote them, were sort of du jour. And I wrote a very controversial essay about becoming obsessed with a Goodreads reviewer who kept trying to lower the rating on my book. And I wrote an essay about like web sleuthing her, but we didn't have those terms back then. We called it internet stalking. And it's an essay about how creepy I am and about me being very creepy and trying to find out who she was and finding out who she was and finding out that she was even creepier than me. She was, an older woman posing as this beautiful young girl who taught high school. And so she would get these like free YA books from publishers because she's posing as like someone who could maybe put the books into a library at school.
Is this
And
true?
yeah, this is all true. And so I found her and I sold the story to the Guardian UK. And part of the way I sold it to them was I said, obviously the only way that this story about anonymity online and me becoming obsessed with this person who isn't who they appear to be, the only way that this can end is with me knocking on their door. So I sold the story and then I had to go knock on her door to finish the story.
Oh
So I
wow.
did, and I was promptly canceled for
Uh,
by the entire Goodreads community. So I was canceled in 2014 before canceled was a word, and it completely upended my life and altered my life. I lost my young adult writing career. I was, written about in all of these publications. And the genesis of it was that these anonymous Goodreads reviewers, like with multiple accounts, they were they were just very active. And
mm.
so Kathleen Hale is a Crazy Stalker is a collection of essays around that central essay.
I
Um,
must say my heart goes out to you because uh, one of the dark sides of true crime writing is it's hard to say whether it's just an obsessive fan, but someone decides that you are Darth Vader, that someone decides that you are like the absolute enemy, and they seem to make it their life's mission to take you
yes,
down. And it's hard to say whether this is just someone who's unhinged or is it actually one of the criminals you're writing about that is trying to discredit you. But if you go into the Shakedown blog, I think it's called shakedowntitle.com, the very last post was on someone called Zala, I think. And she wrote, or I don't know if it's a he or a she, but this person wrote 22 zero-star reviews, 22, right?
yeah,
And then there was another person, I don't know if it is Zala's sort of like the alter ego or the British version or whatever, but there was another something like 18 written on the British site as well. And I just thought this is not acceptable that somebody does this, and you're like, how on earth can Amazon like so someone would tell me that I've read your book, I've written a review and I loved your book, but it's not posting. And then Amazon would
hmm
say, well, you guys emailed one another, so you know one another, so we're not allowing the review to go through. There's some conspiracy here. Then someone
yeah,
else will write all of these, and it's like the first review that comes out is like this North Star, absolutely trashing the book, and it's the first review, and it happens again
Yeah.
and again. It's like impossible that you've read the book, and then Amazon's like, great, well done, it's authentic. And so I also had that same thing as like, um, and unfortunately, to me, and I don't really like this because I feel like you've got to take control of your life and your fate, especially your artistic life, your life as an author. And somebody said, because I used to be on Facebook a lot, as an author, you shouldn't be that accessible. Now, I don't think you're on Twitter, right?
Yeah, I'm not on Twitter. I'm not on social media
Yeah.
anymore.
Yeah, and I mean, that's one of the lessons authors have got to learn. But I think there's a counterpoint to that as well, which is we're living in a time where, for example, exactly what's happening now. Yeah, we are accessible to our readers. Yeah, we are accessible to the public. And the public has become far more um, interactive and wanting to be interactive, and we can be interactive. But there's a point where you open yourself to too much, and you've got to decide for yourself what that is. But all I can say is I can completely understand what you went through there, because I also felt like I want to find this person, have a conversation with them, but
Yeah.
like from another perspective, it's like that's wildly inappropriate.
Yes,
You know what I mean?
exactly. Yeah, and I
But
wanted to explore that line, right? Where like we're in such a at the time we were entering such a culture of anonymity that any kind of face-to-face discussion had become inherently scary and
yeah.
confrontational. So yeah, I completely am with you on every point you're making.
Okay, so let's go back into the Gabby Petito case, and I want to bring up something that I brought up um, sort of very in a very limited way. By the way, Stephanie in chat, because Stephanie was actually the one who alerted me to this. Stephanie, are you here? I see she was in chat 3 minutes ago. Stephanie can kind of keep us honest about this, but um, we have a similar scenario for what happened at Spread Creek Camp. And while we were kind of going through it, Stephanie had been on the Interview Room channel. Are you familiar with that channel?
Mm-mm. No, I'm gonna write it
Um,
down.
so so there's a guy called Chris McDonough, and he runs a channel called the Interview Room, and he did a interview with a park ranger from the Sped Creek camp. I think his name was Jake, and it's around about 1 hour 30, it's just before 1:31, so something like 1 hour 30 minutes and 50 seconds, something like that. Um, and he asked the park ranger, did you see any signs of a struggle?
Mhm.
And unfortunately, Stephanie, if I'm not being completely accurate, then let me know. I actually did write it down. I went back just before we came on just to be accurate. But unfortunately, this guy was extremely vague and also extremely sort of, so he talked about it and then said, I don't really want to talk about it. So it was like frustratingly like a glancing comment. So I think he was asked, did you see any evidence of a struggle? And then at 1:31, he says, I did see things. And then he said, footprints. And then he spoke then in this very dissociated way about what he saw. He said something about he could see that the pair engaged in, and then he said, I don't really want to speak about it anymore. So it was quite hard to say, are you kind of walking back what you're saying? Are you not sure about what you're saying? Because bear in mind the fact that there's a dead body lying there, the fact that somebody has died there means obviously there was a struggle,
Yeah.
right? So, and he would know that because he was there. But then to say, well, I saw footprints, and then to say, well, footprints is a sign of a struggle, you then you kind of think, well, how, and
Mhm.
also how would you see footprints?
Mhm.
Because there's like stones all over the place.
Right,
So
yeah.
was there a section where there was mud and the mud was sort of, there was like lots of feet patterns in a circle and the mud was sort of like that? The other side of it is, if Brian did something to Gabby and she's now deceased and he's carrying her from point A to B,
Right.
that might look like a struggle as well. But I mean, you don't see that sort of thing. If someone has attacked someone in a car or in a building, you're not going to really see footprints in the way that you see in nature, where the earth will be shifted to some extent, and you can kind of, almost like handwriting, you can see to what extent the feet or shoes push the earth. You know what I mean? If it's a flat surface like a carpet or cement, all you're going to see is the footprint. But in nature, you might see, if there's mud, for example, you might actually see the weight that is pushed or something like that. Now, I don't know if that's what he's talking about, but overall, it just seems so vague that you sort of got to look at what he's saying there, and then look at what we've looked at. For example, that she didn't have her shoes on, she didn't have her hiking boots on. The fact that we know that there was a tent, right? We know the tent was there. And I don't know about you, but I assume that all of this happened at night.
Yeah.
Because in the day you have people wandering around at night. People are
Right.
sort of, they are in a camping situation, they remain where they are, right?
Yeah.
And also,
Yeah.
in a nighttime situation, people become more intimate. That if it's cold, they will sit closer to one another, and that's also when you can have a disturbance or an altercation. And if you take all of that together, plus it was cold, it seems to be more evidence that something happened in the tent than not.
I totally agree with you. And my theory, and obviously I couldn't say this in the article because it needed to be heavily fact checked. Every single thing
Mm,
needed to line up with an actual fact. But what's coming out now in the civil suit is really interesting. The hearing that they had and the evidentiary materials that is making its way in, is that Brian told his parents on or around the 28th that he killed Gabby. That was before he even got home. So my
mm,
theory has always been that she broke up with him at Mary Piglet's. Statistically, breakups are often what cause fatal uh, forms of domestic um, violence. So I think she broke up with him at lunch. I think that he had a fit and was going in and out of the place and all of that stuff. I think that they went back to Spread Creek. I think Gabby said, I'm going to sleep in the tent. You sleep in the van. I think that there was some kind of conversation about that. That was the 27th. I think she died that night. If he told his
mm.
parents on the 28th, then I think that the fight that started at Mary Piglet's per- kept going when they got back. And I think he went into the tent and I think he strangled her while she was sleeping and I think she woke up and she couldn't get away.
Well, if you think about the Moab incident, it may have been in a way a precursor and a kind of a trial run, and also kind of psychological mirroring. What I mean is, they had an argument there, and the result was that the officers said, "Okay, we're going to separate you. One's going to sleep in the van, the other one's going to sleep somewhere else." Right? So they
Yeah,
may have said, we're having an argument now. We're going to do the same thing. One of us is going to sleep in the van. Someone is going to sleep somewhere else. And Brian was like, "No, I'm not going to be told what to do by you," kind of thing.
yeah, absolutely. Mary Rose said, "Was there signs of someone being chased?" That was something that I was really interested about when I first started thinking about this. Was she not wearing shoes because she had carried them with her to walk across these creeks? Because they were surrounded by these ankle deep creeks.
Mm,
Um, but the reason that I think it might have happened in the tent is that she was she she was really throttled, which is like a medical term for being basically blunt force trauma all over your head because you're holding her by the neck and hitting her
mm.
head on the rocky ground. So they there would have been blood. There would have been a lot of blood on the rocks and things like that. but it is an interesting theory, and I think it's possible that he might have chased her. I just don't. I'm just not sure. Obviously, no one is.
So do you want to check out what Stephanie's written there?
Great. So he said he saw a pair of footprints that looked like a struggle and limbs and sticks thrown or placed in bushes that had not naturally fallen there. That's interesting. I guess I would be interested in knowing when he saw this, how soon
Yeah,
after, because the crime scene quickly became a tourist attraction.
yeah.
Renowned
Yeah, and I
survivalist Jake.
mean, I think you've also got to bear in mind the whole point of campsites is that you get firewood and you assemble. I don't really know what the situation was there. Um, I would assume that you've actually got to buy firewood from somewhere else. You can't just chop down trees or even find it, but I don't know what it is. But
Oh yeah,
you could have a situation where someone, like it's kind of where I live in South Africa, we've got a farm and there's often uh, floods and there's often a lot of wood debris along the river, and it's not
hmm
hard to find. And I don't know whether they allow that debris to be burned by campers because in a way, it actually reduces the fire hazard then by getting rid of this dry timber. I don't know if that's, but you would also imagine that that's habitats for insects and other mice and rabbits and whatever, underneath the logs or whatever. And so you could have a situation where they say you've got to buy your own wood, kind of thing,
hmm
and bring it there. But if that's not the case, then it could be that you just have campers that are collecting wood, and that's what they saw. But I mean, unfortunately, he doesn't provide his surname. His name's Jake. I suppose if you really want to get hold of him, you could contact Chris McDonough from the interview room because he spoke to him in a live. So Chris McDonough would know how to get hold of him, and then
Yeah,
maybe he could tell you about that. The other thing is it might come out in the discovery. But I'm going to say
yeah,
this in terms of that. My initial theory was also something really unpleasant happened at Mary Piglet's, and then there was an aftermath that was almost immediate in the van. So my
yeah,
initial theory was they sort of had an argument that everybody witnessed. People in the Mary Piglet's witnessed to the extent that Mary Piglet's staff said, we're not going to say anything, no comment. You know what I
yeah,
mean? We're not going to
yeah.
say anything. And then and it's also unfortunate that I don't think any CCTV survived from the Mary Piglets. You know what I mean?
Yes, yeah, yeah, because they erase it regularly.
Yeah, I mean, can you imagine you have the body cam of Moab and then you had CCTV of Mary Piglet? So it would be
It would be
almost
so
like
good.
everything you needed. But
Yeah,
the part where, for me, it's a little bit not quite as straightforward is, and it again reminds me a little bit of the coverage of the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. Is in the beginning the Gabby Petito case was actually a lot like that. It was a social media sort of bonanza, and there were people coming from other platforms, not really typically associated with the true crime community. TikTok is something that's sort of grown and kind of starting to sort of invade, I feel, in a way, because TikTok's like short attention span. True crime, especially if you take the Moab incident, that's a really good example. You need to have a long attention span, you need stamina, you need to concentrate, you need to focus, you need to understand the subtlety, you need to read these narratives over and over again, you've got to study it. You can't just kind of quickly come up with, oh, that's my assessment. The
hmm
Moab incident is a fantastic example of um, where things aren't black and white, which is not absolutely obvious, even though it may seem quite obvious. And I kind of got the sense that the initial stories dealing with Mary Piglets was that I think the initial story was that Brian was behaving in a very odd way and he was obnoxious. But you kind of got the idea was that Brian was the villain all along. So Brian had to be the obnoxious person. And I don't know if you remember, as time went by, things started to come out that were totally different. Was that Gabby was actually unhappy with things, and I think Gabby actually spoke to the restaurant manager, and Gabby kind of came back in. Am I right, or am I not remembering that right? That Gabby went back into the restaurant a second time, not Brian.
So it seemed that he sent her in because she very reluctantly asked for a refund, which I think was
Yeah, yeah,
probably spearheaded by him, and she also apologized for his behavior.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think she was embarrassed. I think she was embarrassed by him.
But and I don't want to be devil's advocate for Brian, God forbid, but I remember the restaurant manager, and it was kind of hard to say, is your memory dodgy or did you just not notice anything? But I remember her kind of saying it wasn't really a big deal. I didn't really notice anything. But all of that kind of made me think something happened at Mary Piglet's that definitely wasn't pleasant. But I ended up thinking, I think they went from there, and it could have been something else like um, Gabby wasn't happy to pay, or it cost more than what she expected, right?
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Like, because they were eating at a restaurant and it was more expensive than she expected. And then out of that, or she may even have said there, Rose is going to join us. And then Brian was
Mm.
fed up from there.
Mhm,
You know what I mean?
mhm, mhm.
But I do think from then on, things sort of, went awry in a big way. But I mean, to me, it's not rocket science. We know that Brian is the perpetrator, right? We know that, and we know things weren't happy at the Merry Piglets, and we
Right.
also know that Rose is going to join them, and we also know that the finances were the thing. The part that's hard for us, I think, as narrators, is to say, um, because there's that big chunk of time. What was the actual substance of the conversation? Unfortunately, there's no social media from the Grand Tetons, but
Mhm.
hopefully, what will come out are text messages from that time.
Yeah. Yeah, there's gonna be a lot of really interesting things coming out soon. The thing I'm most interested in seeing is there's a letter that was found with Brian's belongings, and it's from his mom, and you guys have probably already seen this, but all it says on the front is, "Burn this after reading."
Yeah.
And it mentions Gabby, and it states some kind of plan to, like, get Brian weapons in prison if he needs them. So I always thought that people were being conspiracy theorists by kind of overstating the involvement of his family in his escape, but it turns out they were right. Like, his family was his family knew about this the entire time he was home. They went camping together. I mean, I'm fascinated in the role of his parents in this, and, like, what kind of they just seem so cold. And I mean, I know it's a big question. How far would you go for your kid? Would you help them get out of the country if they strangled their girlfriend to death? It's sort of complicated, but,
Mm.
I think that they have a lot of materials that are gonna come out, and I think that part of the reason why Gabby's parents brought this lawsuit is to have some semblance of justice by sort of prosecuting Brian on the public stage and his family, and I don't think it's about the money for them, otherwise they'd be asking for a lot more than $30,000 to cover her funeral costs. I think for them, it's about getting evidentiary materials submitted into public records so that they can be, released to the rest of us. Um,
Have you reached out to them?
I have, yeah, I have. I mean, not in, I reached out to them to give them a heads up that the Vanity Fair piece was coming out. Like I said, it was really important to me to have the method of reporting thematically linked to the way that the story was being told, which is just internet reporting. I'm I would love to speak to them, but they've also made it very clear to everybody that they would rather be left alone. So I've talked to their lawyer a couple of times just to be like, here's a heads up, this piece is coming out. It's very compassionate toward Gabby. I don't think that they should be worried about it, but I just wanted them to know that it was coming. And Stephanie, thank you so much for bringing Jake's perspective into it. I'm definitely gonna follow up on that, and um, really, really appreciate the info.
Yeah. So I can tell you, I've got a bit of experience where the first case I wrote about was Oscar Pistorius and Reva Steenkamp, and I was friends with Reva on Facebook. We weren't like We didn't know each other well at all, but I felt like I had some kind of connection to her. And anyway, long story short, I was telling her story, and Oscar was kind of making her invisible in more ways than one. And her parents were very traumatized. They still are. In fact, her father's only now just spoken to Oscar in prison. And I said to my co-author, we wrote a couple of books together, but I did say, I don't think he's going to get any closure or answers that he's looking for. Oscar's not going to, anyway. So the part that's quite interesting is you kind of got a sense from her parents that they didn't want to think about what was going on. They didn't want to deal with what was going on. I'm talking about months later, going up to a year later, and even beyond that. And of course, it was kind of our job, Lisa's and mine, covering the story, to cover everything. That was kind of our job. That was the kind of the mission we gave ourselves, to give Reva a voice. And my very first book was Reva in her own words. The idea wasn't that I'm going to impose myself on the narrative. It was like, she's going to, these are all her words. The entire narrative was like her words kind of thing, right? And I must say that is something that I've tried to keep through all the narratives I've written, and that's something you did very well in your piece. I thought you did that very, very well, letting their words do most of the talking. You know what I mean? What has actually been definitely said, let that be the narrative. There's no way to write a more authentic narrative than that, is you let their words speak for themselves. You know what I mean? And you sort of tie it together. But the part that was quite interesting and quite tragic was eventually Lisa and I had kind of elevated ourselves to people who became kind of, certainly in the eyes of some people, the experts on a particular version of events. So there was the version of events where X, Y, and Z, and then there was the version of events where A, B, and C. And there was ultimately a court narrative that didn't correspond to either of them, where they said Oscar's guilty of killing an intruder, which isn't actually what happened. You know what I mean? It's like, well, Reva actually was there. She wasn't an intruder. So even the court narrative excised her from the actual narrative, right? And anyway, long story short, Reva's parents wanted to actually see us. They wanted to talk to us. And you really got a sense of, despite the fact that they didn't want to talk to anyone, despite the fact that they didn't want to give any interviews, despite the fact that they were unavailable and everything, and so compromised, they were obviously dreaming about it every night, thinking about it every day, totally overwhelmed by it all. And they did need someone who was thinking about it and who was facing that reality, because a day would come where they would feel like, you know what, I don't want to think about it. I want to move on with my life, but I can't. I can't forget what has happened. And the worst part is I don't know what happened. And then they came to us and they said, what do you think happened? And they asked us some quite private and personal questions. And they had one or two ideas, and we had knowledge that they didn't have, and they had some knowledge that we didn't have. But together, we were able to piece certain things together. And at the end of the day, the only solace is in reality. I hate to say it. There isn't solace from running away from reality, because it's always going to run. It's always going to be trying to catch up to you, especially when a crime has taken place. When someone has died, that's a permanent reality that sort of haunts you, especially if it's someone close to you. It's a permanent thing that haunts you until the end of time. And for as long as you don't understand what happened, you have even less peace about it. And it is very painful to confront that reality. But it's only after you've done that confronting of reality that there's a sense of it fitting somewhere and making some, even if it doesn't make sense, it makes some kind of psychological sense, if that makes sense, you know?
Absolutely.
And so in that sense, don't feel disheartened if they don't reach out to you. It's not the right time. But as long as your narrative is authentic, right, it's going to matter to them, and they will probably pay attention to it. They just don't want to be involved, right?
Yeah, which I totally understand. I mean, I think one of the saddest things about this case is that it really reminds us how much how much a criminal trial functions as a stage for truth and the truth to come out.
Yeah,
There
yeah, yeah,
can't be
yeah,
you can't prosecute a murder without a murderer, and so the things like the, DNA in the tent, the DNA in the van, and just piecing together what actually happened,
yeah.
in the way that as a parent you would wanna know what happened to your child, it's not going to happen, and I think
Your sound's off. Yeah, I can't hear you. Have you muted yourself?
there we go. Is that better?
Yeah,
So, I think ironically, because there was so much web sleuthing going on, and so in that sense, the internet really kind of helped, I guess, in certain ways. I don't know. I think that that was the sense, right? Is that this is a case that's being solved online and the internet is helping. But I feel like the the vigilantes in Florida who showed up on the laundry's lawn, I think that if that hadn't happened, Brian was so narcissistic that he would have thought, "I can get away with this," and it would have given the police time to come up with a good reason to bring him in and to prosecute this. Instead, he had because he's so arrogant, I don't think he would've I think he would've thought he would get away with it, but he had these people on his lawn, the internet was standing on his his front door, his front stoop, and they were screaming at him, calling him a murderer, and I don't think he would've gone out and killed himself if those people hadn't been there, these living, breathing reminders of his own guilt, and I think we might have gotten a criminal trial, and he might be, on his way to prison if that hadn't happened.
I don't see him as narcissistic.
What's your diagnosis?
Um, I see him as being almost the opposite of narcissistic, which
Mm,
is, in other words, someone who needs to be more narcissistic, if you know what I mean.
mm,
In other
mhm,
words, Gabby fueled his narcissism, but from the perspective of someone who has very low self-esteem. So I would
mm,
say more low self-esteem, low confidence. I think he got a big head because he was with Gabby. But if you think about just, and I don't want to go into this in too much detail, but if you think about the classic definition of narcissism, that sort of grandioseness, he doesn't strike me as a grandiose person, although when he's with Gabby, that is an aspect. But I just mean when you see him, um, how he dresses kind of in a quite an understated way. He is kind of quite a quiet guy, he's kind of a loner. His
mhm,
social media is also, there's not a lot of social media. One of the classic signs of narcissism is excessive social media, right? I'm talking
mhm,
about, and so I think narcissism is a factor, but it's a factor in terms of Brian, where Brian has unhealthy narcissism. He doesn't think enough of himself. He hasn't
mhm,
made enough of himself. I think
mhm,
there is a lot of fantasy going on here, which is true of a lot of young people. I mean, and something I want to talk about in the last 5 or 10 minutes. Why does this case resonate so much with us? Why
mhm,
does it resonate now? Right? Why has it resonated? Um, one of the reasons why I think it made more and more of an impact with me was when I was in my 20s, I went to the UK with like the love of my life, and I had these kind of unrealistic expectations. I remember I had a thought. This was the first time I went overseas. I had this thought: is reality, is being in this country, is watching Wimbledon, is going to the Tour de France. And I did all of those things, which is funny enough happening at this time. So it was around about this time that I left South Africa and I went abroad. But I remember thinking, is it going to be more fun and more amazing and more exciting actually being there or watching it on TV?
mm,
And
mhm,
it ended up being quite a valid point, because when I was there, it was like, this is exciting and I can take photos and I can brag about it. But it's kind of, like I'm missing a lot that I would have seen if I was watching it on TV. I mean,
mhm,
if you care about the sport kind of thing. But not only that, when you went to real places in the real world, it didn't really match the brochure. So a lot of the real world is really disappointing.
mhm,
It's tacky, it's dirty, it's littered. They're objectionable characters. It takes a lot of effort and frustration to get there in the first place. And so it really interferes with that whole idealism. And I think a lot of the Gabby Petito story is about the destruction of idealism, where it's not just the end of idealism, it's like where it's destroyed, where it comes to
Mhm.
catastrophic end.
Mhm.
And I did the same thing. I went overseas. I was with someone I really loved, and there was so much disappointment and reality, biting and knocking and all that. And it was also in a way a disaster. Our
Yeah.
trip was sort of a disaster, and nobody died, and there was no violence or anything, but there was certainly a heck of a lot of trauma. And that's
Mhm.
something I really recognize with them is you step out into the world and it's supposed to be this adventure, and it ends up being this misadventure.
Mhm.
um, you have all of this courage and you think you have all of this knowledge only to be um, uh, well, in their case, destroyed. So you go out into the world, you have an adventure, and you end up being destroyed, kind of thing.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on. Um, I wrote it down here. Why did it resonate that you wanted to express yourself on it?
Mm.
Also, what is it about this case that caught the attention of so many in America? Is it the idealism? Um, was it the context of COVID? Because COVID does
Mm.
actually play a role in the story.
Mhm.
And then I don't know if you can remember all of this, but the other aspect to it is how did COVID impact you? Didn't it help you be a better writer? Like when you had to stay at home, well, now I
Yeah,
can write. Now I actually have an excuse to stay in one place and just write, write, write.
that's so funny. I mean, okay, so the first question, sorry, can you ask me that again really quickly?
Yeah, so why did it resonate
Okay.
that you wanted to express yourself on it?
Yeah, so this is probably gonna make me sound a little bit petty, but, the more that I learned about Brian, the more I recognized a certain type of person who I've interacted with a lot, and I think maybe a lot of us have interacted with this kind of person. It's the kind of person who is misinformed about the causes that they promote and who believes in activism at the expense of humanity. So, for instance, just one of my most recent run-ins with the person of this kind is my neighbor. His name is we won't name him in case he's watching this, but he'll be able to recognize himself anyway. So let's just call him Ryan. And there was this elderly couple living on my street, Bill and Peter, and they've lived here since the 60s. You know, they're a gay couple. They've seen so many people die during the AIDS crisis. They lived through that, and like a lot of people who've been through trauma, they are hoarders. And so their neighbors would have to use rat poison around the house. And Ryan found some dead raccoons from the rat poison. And what he did to raise awareness about how bad rat poison is he stacked the raccoon carcasses in Bill and Peter's lawn. I'm talking an elderly couple. They were on their way to a home because they are no longer able bodied. These are two very, very old men, and he stacked raccoon carcasses on their lawn with a sign about what they had been doing with rat poison and shaming them and intimidating them. And that is the kind of person who Ryan Laundrie was. He was, like he was like, don't kill plants, but he would tear them apart to like do little spreads for things he was selling online. Julie's saying, I think he had poor social skills and was bitter and lacked self-esteem. He was all around inadequate. Yes. He was also a very specific kind of failure. He was a failed artist, and we know from history that the being a failed artist is its own kind of villain origin story. The most obvious example that springs to mind is Hitler. Hitler was a failed artist. So Brian had gotten everything he wanted for his entire life, and he had constructed this story of himself as a brooding loner artist, and that turned out not to be true. And he was so angry about his failures that he took out those frustrations on the people closest to him, it happened to be Gabby, and that is the definition of a bully. So I saw Brian, I saw a bully, I saw a very specific kind of modern, angry young man, as they used to be called, somebody who is all about, saving wild birds, in Ryan, my neighbor Ryard's case, but also like promotes that cause by intimidating and scaring weaker people. So that was really what drew me in. I think that what captured like the nation's attention was probably just the failed van life journey, because it
Mm.
was the exposure of it was like it exposed social media as like being superficial, and I think that that's something that there's a real like hunger for, what's going on in social media versus what's going on behind the scenes. And I think that COVID really brought that up so much, because people's like idealized you know posts and stuff, people were starting to be like, this is what it looks like on Instagram, but here's what it is behind the scenes. It's like
Mm.
a dirty corner. And so I think that it's just sort of all played into this thing that people were hungry to talk about, which is like the superficiality of social media. For me, it was somehow very
Can
much
I
about Brian.
say something? I think there are two dimensions to the true crime community, and I think some people are going to be like offended and not happy with me saying this. But the one dimension is exactly what you're talking about, and it's also what I saw, which is the social media is inauthentic and it's fake, and reality is something different and whatever. But I think you have another dimension, which is often the bigger dimension in the true crime community, which is I don't care about that. Obviously, it's fake, or
Yeah,
but I don't care. And it's like, well, look at this and look at that and look at that and look how pretty Gabby was, and look at where they were. You know what I mean? And the fake side is like it's not a conversation, if you know what I'm saying.
hmm,
The other thing that I think stood out very much for me, not in America, was like what an American story this is.
yes, absolutely.
Like it's America's on being showcased. I mean, I was like getting to know America so much. I was like, I want to go to America. I want to go there. I want to go there, kind of thing. And I'm sure
Yeah,
Americans felt the same way, especially post COVID. Like I've been stuck here. I also want to get out. Exactly how Gabby and Brian felt. I also want to be
absolutely.
idealistic and just go out there, kind of thing. And I
Yeah.
actually still have that feeling. But the other thing is, uh, what was it? I've got so many thoughts that I'm trying to, because I'm running out of time. I've got like 7 minutes. Um, Calling her America's daughter, she also had
Mm,
that American blue-eyed, blonde-haired, you might say privileged white girl, but just in a very basic way, she was like America's daughter. And that was
mhm.
just in a very simple way. You might say, well, I didn't like that about it, but it was nevertheless what it was. Um, so it was this very American story, also about America's daughter. And if you think about this idea of someone who's not a perfect victim, Gabby really was a perfect victim. Just someone who's so um, beautiful and innocent and sweet and kind and fragile. And then the way that it ended. Um, Something I wanted to ask you, because you paid attention to their social media, did you notice um, their interest in Vincent van Gogh,
Yes, I
their
did,
interest in the
and
failed artist? Yeah,
yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah, she loved Vincent van Gogh, and, there were, like, mini I don't know if she had recreated them, but there were, like, mini Van Gogh paintings or postcards in the
yeah, yeah,
back
yeah.
of the
Like the
yeah,
sun and the stars in the van, yeah.
yeah,
And I mean, you can actually imagine that Gabby and Brian had that in common, where Gabby liked probably his art, and Brian liked the troubled artist motif, kind of thing.
yes.
Like, yeah,
Yeah,
definitely interesting.
that's so true. Yeah, they both definitely romanticized, the brooding artist, and I think that that's sort of what brought them together at the beginning of it, because she was very creative and wanted to be with an artist, and he fronted as an artist, and over the course of the relationship, she saw him fail at what he had pretended to be.
Well, you know what? I think you and I and Hitler have shown, and maybe Brian, I hate to put us all in the same pot, but we've all shown how torturous it can be to be a failing artist, or to have a critic that drives you nuts. It's
Yeah,
like, you know what I mean? And there's nothing worse than seeing yourself as an artist and you fail. What do you do with that? It does torture you, it does torment you, and it can turn you into an a-hole. It can turn a nice person into a total jerk. So I've actually got to end this because the power's going to go off and I'm going to just be gone. But it's been great chatting to you. I did want to talk to you a little bit about, was this planned, was it premeditated? And then just these drawings, the gratuitous nature of the drawings, but can maybe save that for another time. Can you come on when your book is closer to being published and do a bit of a reading from somewhere else in the book? Could you maybe do
I would
that?
love that. I would love that. Thank you so much. I would love to come back.
It's really been awesome talking to you, and it's really refreshing having a young author's voice, because a lot of authors are these sort of has-beens, and you know what I mean, like the guy who wrote I'm just saying, in my mind, I often think of authors as the guy who wrote uh, uh, Game of Thrones. You have that sort of vibe, you know what I mean? And it's refreshing because you bring a lot of youthful knowledge of that whole knowledge base, which is so important to a story about two young people. That's really valuable. In a way, you talk their language. There's some things you mentioned that just totally resonate because it's your world. So anyway, that's really valuable. So I've kind of got 3 minutes left. I've got to sign off before I can't sign off.
Great.
But anyway, it's been wonderful having you. Guys, go and read Kathleen's article if you haven't already read it. What's going on here? And then make sure you go to Kathleen's author page, and bear in mind this book that's going to be coming out quite soon. When's that coming out?
August 16th.
August 16th. Okay. I'm going to have to sign off. I've got about 2 minutes left, but I want to be off before the power goes off. Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, mods and members. See you guys next time.
Bye, everyone.
Take care,
Thank you so
Kathleen.
much.
Cheers.
You too. Bye, Nick.
Bye-bye.